There is something deeply unsettling about the moment an empath stops chasing. Many emotionally distant people have built their relationships around a pattern that feels familiar without even realizing it. They step back and someone moves closer. They become quiet and another person rushes in with reassurance, explanations, or endless emotional effort. They create space and someone else works tirelessly to close it. Over time, this pattern begins to feel normal. It quietly reinforces the belief that closeness can always be managed from a safe distance and that no matter how far they withdraw, the other person will continue waiting with open arms. Then one day, they meet someone different. This person is deeply caring. They offer warmth, kindness, patience, and genuine understanding. But unlike the people before them, they do not chase. They do not sacrifice their self-respect in the hope of keeping love alive. They understand the difference between compassion and losing themselves. They remain open, but they stay grounded. They remain loving, yet emotionally balanced. That combination becomes surprisingly difficult to ignore because it disrupts everything the emotionally distant person expected. They expected silence to create anxiety. They expected distance to increase pursuit. They expected withdrawal to inspire greater effort. Instead, they find someone who remains calm, someone who cares without clinging, someone whose emotional balance is not controlled by another person's behavior. Stay with me, because this shift changes the entire relationship dynamic in ways most people never recognize. Those expectations did not appear out of nowhere. They developed through years of repeating similar emotional experiences. Protective habits were built around them until they became almost automatic. But when the familiar response disappears, the emotional script no longer works. Distance no longer creates control. Silence no longer guarantees pursuit. Instead of chasing, the empath remains steady. Instead of proving their value, they quietly remember it. Instead of begging for reassurance, they continue living with confidence and self-respect. That quiet confidence carries tremendous emotional weight because it forces the other person into unfamiliar territory. For perhaps the first time, they meet someone whose emotional stability does not rise and fall with every moment of closeness or distance. Without speaking directly, the empath communicates a powerful message. I care about you, but I will not lose myself to keep this connection alive. That sentence is never spoken, yet it can be felt in every action. It is a kind of emotional strength many people have never encountered before. Why does it matter so much? Because emotionally distant relationship patterns often rely on imbalance. One person reaches while the other pulls away. One person carries the emotional weight while the other keeps their guard up. That imbalance creates a sense of safety because it preserves emotional control. But when the empath refuses to participate in that pattern, the balance shifts. Suddenly, closeness exists without dependence, and that changes everything. Keep watching, because the next part explains why this often creates uncertainty in someone who once felt completely in control. As that familiar pattern begins to disappear, something new quietly emerges. Uncertainty. The emotionally distant partner begins wondering whether this relationship might actually end. They realize the love being offered is sincere, but it is not unconditional in the unhealthy sense. It is generous, yet it still has boundaries. That realization begins to shake emotional walls that once felt permanent. What makes someone unforgettable is rarely emotional intensity. More often, it is integrity. Someone who constantly chases may genuinely love deeply, but endless pursuit can unintentionally reinforce the belief that the relationship will always survive no matter what happens. The empath who remains present without chasing communicates something far more lasting. My love is real, but so are my boundaries. That message stays with people because it combines warmth with quiet strength. Human beings are naturally affected by people they cannot emotionally control. Even if they cannot explain it consciously, they begin noticing the absence of desperation. They notice calm where they expected panic. They notice dignity where they expected emotional collapse. They notice someone who gives generously without becoming emotionally dependent. That creates something even stronger than affection. It creates respect. Affection is sometimes taken for granted. Constant devotion can become expected. But self-respect naturally commands attention because it interrupts familiar habits and invites reflection. It quietly introduces a healthier picture of intimacy, one built on connection instead of control. That is why this kind of empath becomes unforgettable, not because they demanded attention, not because they fought to be chosen, but because they showed what it looks like to care deeply without giving themselves away. That kind of presence often remains in someone's mind long after the relationship changes because it reflects the kind of love many secretly hope exists, steady, mature, dependable, and strong enough to remain standing even when fear appears. What makes a grounded empath especially difficult to forget is not excitement, drama, or emotional intensity. It is peaceful consistency. Emotionally distant people are often responding less to love itself and more to what love awakens inside them. In many relationships, closeness quickly becomes filled with emotional pressure. The other person grows anxious, becomes reactive, or desperately tries to pull the relationship back together. Those reactions unintentionally strengthen the belief that intimacy always brings pressure, expectations, and the loss of personal freedom. As a result, emotional distance increases, not necessarily because feelings disappear, but because those feelings become overwhelming without healthy ways to process them. Now imagine a different situation. This empath is emotionally aware without becoming emotionally reactive. They feel deeply, but they do not lose themselves in fear. When communication becomes inconsistent, they do not immediately seek constant reassurance. When distance appears, they do not automatically assume rejection. Instead, they observe. They remain connected to themselves. They continue living according to their own values. That steadiness transforms the emotional atmosphere because the expected escalation never arrives. Rather than abandoning themselves to save the relationship, they stay emotionally centered. This creates a quiet contradiction. On one side, there is emotional safety because the empath is not demanding, controlling, or manipulative. There is no pressure to force vulnerability before it is ready. That naturally feels less threatening. On the other side, there is something much harder to ignore: quiet accountability. Without criticism or blame, the empath's steady presence communicates another powerful truth. I can love you without losing myself, and I will not build a relationship that requires me to sacrifice my emotional stability. Those words may never be spoken directly, yet they are deeply understood. They reveal that emotional withdrawal is not without consequences. It shapes the relationship, it influences trust. And because those effects are being witnessed calmly instead of emotionally exaggerated, an important shift begins. Old stories about needing endless space or believing every relationship is overwhelming are gently challenged by the simple example of someone who remains emotionally consistent. There is no aggression, there is no emotional game, there is only clarity. And sometimes clarity creates more lasting change than confrontation ever could. The emotionally distant partner slowly begins noticing something they never expected. The strategies that once felt reliable are no longer producing the same results. Pulling away does not automatically inspire pursuit. Silence no longer creates panic. Emotional distance does not trigger endless reassurance or emotional overreaction. Instead, it is met with calm observation. And that calmness is exactly what becomes unsettling because it introduces a possibility they may never have seriously considered before. They are no longer interacting with someone whose emotional stability depends on their attention. They are facing someone who regulates their own emotions. A person who remains grounded cannot be controlled through inconsistency because their peace does not depend on another person's behavior. This is where secure empathy becomes truly powerful, not through pressure or persuasion, but through contrast. It quietly reveals another way of experiencing love, a way where closeness is not built on anxiety, a way where connection does not require sacrificing yourself, a way where people stay because they choose to, not because fear forces them to. That contrast creates an uncomfortable but important tension inside the emotionally distant person. They may not immediately change how they behave, but something begins shifting beneath the surface. They notice that old habits are no longer met with emotional chaos. They are met with clarity. And clarity is often much harder to ignore than emotional reactions because clarity removes confusion. It removes excuses. It gently reveals that every action has consequences for the relationship. Stay with me, because this quiet shift is often where genuine personal growth first begins. In that space of clarity, something important changes. They are no longer standing across from someone trying to rescue them, fix them, or convince them to stay. Instead, they are meeting someone who has simply decided not to participate in emotional instability anymore. That is the quiet strength of secure empathy. It does not force anyone to change. It simply allows reality to become visible. Without constant chasing, pleading, or emotional escalation, the emotionally distant person is left facing something much more difficult to avoid: self-awareness. And self-awareness has always been the beginning of meaningful transformation. Once someone clearly sees how their emotional habits influence trust, closeness, and connection, it becomes very difficult to return to complete ignorance. The securely grounded empath never wins through pursuit. They leave a lasting impression through steady presence. That presence becomes a mirror reflecting patterns that defensive habits can no longer completely hide. In the end, what unsettles the emotionally distant person is not that someone suddenly expects more from them. It is realizing that someone can remain emotionally genuine without constantly chasing after them. That realization quietly changes everything, because once love is no longer powered by pursuit, emotional avoidance gradually loses much of its influence. What remains is something simple, quiet, and impossible to ignore forever: the truth. The truth that healthy connection cannot be sustained through distance alone. The truth that consistency matters. The truth that genuine intimacy asks both people to participate. And once that truth has been seen, it rarely disappears completely. It is also important to remember that emotional attachment is about far more than intense moments. It is about the lasting impression someone leaves on another person's nervous system. Many emotionally distant people move through relationships believing each one simply was not meant to last. They convince themselves it was never serious enough, or that the connection simply was not the right fit. But every so often, one relationship refuses to disappear so easily. It lingers quietly in memory, not because it was dramatic or filled with constant conflict, but because it reached a place their usual emotional defenses could not fully block. That is where this kind of empath becomes especially meaningful. They do not create emotional noise. They create emotional presence. There is a significant difference. Many people respond to emotional distance by changing themselves. They become more anxious. They demand more reassurance. They work harder to earn closeness. They perform instead of simply existing authentically. Those patterns often become loud and emotionally exhausting. Over time, they reinforce the belief that intimacy always arrives carrying pressure. But the empath described here follows a different path. They never stop feeling deeply. They never lose their compassion, yet they refuse to reshape themselves simply to remain close. They meet the other person with honesty. They listen without overreaching. They care without collapsing under emotional uncertainty. They stay engaged while remaining connected to themselves. That rare combination creates something lasting because what is experienced is not emotional pressure, but emotional ease. It is not forced understanding, but quiet acceptance. It is not demanding closeness, but connection that feels natural. And while that kind of emotional safety may feel unfamiliar, it is also surprisingly memorable. This is where the deeper psychology quietly unfolds. Emotional distance often develops because closeness has become associated with losing independence or personal freedom. But when someone experiences another person who is both emotionally available and emotionally secure within themselves, an entirely new possibility begins to form. Instead of believing closeness always brings pressure, the nervous system starts recognizing that closeness might actually feel safe. That shift is subtle, yet incredibly important. Even if the relationship eventually ends, the body remembers experiences of emotional safety long before the mind fully understands them. Outwardly, the emotionally distant person may appear to move on. They may minimize what happened or convince themselves they are unaffected. Yet internally, something remains unfinished because emotional presence of that quality is difficult to replace. Over time, a quiet comparison begins. New relationships may feel flatter or less emotionally fulfilling. Not because the new people lack value, but because the sense of grounded connection is missing. This is why the empath becomes unforgettable. Not because they were the most dramatic or demanded the most attention, but because they offered the most emotionally balanced experience. There is another layer that often goes unnoticed. The empath creates more than connection. They create recognition. The emotionally distant person feels understood without feeling pressured or invaded. They are not analyzed endlessly. They are not forced into emotional exposure before they are ready. Instead, they are accepted where they are. Being seen without being chased creates an unusual inner experience. It softens emotional defenses without creating resistance. It increases awareness without demanding immediate surrender. Human beings rarely forget environments where they felt both emotionally safe and genuinely understood. Those experiences quietly become emotional reference points stored deep within memory. Later, when other relationships feel either overwhelming or emotionally empty, those earlier experiences naturally become a standard of comparison. Longing often grows not only for the individual, but for the emotional state they helped create. That difference matters because what remains is not unhealthy dependence. It is an emotional imprint, a lasting memory of what healthy connection felt like. Distance does not erase that memory. If anything, distance often strengthens it because without constant interaction, the mind begins revisiting meaningful moments more clearly. While life moves forward externally, the inner world continues processing what once felt different. And sometimes true transformation begins in exactly that quiet place, not through pressure, not through pursuit, but through a memory that gently refuses to disappear. In the end, what makes this empath unforgettable is not that they held on more tightly than everyone else. It is that they offered something rare enough to remain meaningful long after they were gone. People rarely forget what it felt like to be both emotionally safe and emotionally understood at the same time. Sometimes it simply takes them much longer to recognize the value of what they experienced. And perhaps the greatest turning point in any relationship arrives when emotional availability stops being automatic and begins becoming a conscious choice made by two people who are both willing to protect the connection without losing themselves. Up to this point in the relationship, the empath has often carried the role of the steady emotional anchor. They try to understand instead of judge. They adjust instead of react. They wait patiently. They read between the lines of silence. They create space for difficult emotions. And many times, they accept inconsistency much longer than they truly should. This is not because they lack strength. It is because they naturally notice emotional details that other people often miss. They recognize possibilities where others only see distance. They sense connection where others feel uncertainty. But eventually, something important begins to change. The empath realizes that love without mutual effort is not emotional depth. It is emotional exhaustion. That realization does not arrive through anger or resentment. It arrives through clarity. They stop giving more than they receive. They stop filling emotional gaps that the other person refuses to acknowledge. They stop believing every inconsistency is their responsibility to solve. Instead, they begin setting boundaries that are calm, thoughtful, and deeply grounded. This is where the relationship quietly shifts. Someone who has become comfortable with inconsistency suddenly finds themselves facing something entirely different. Boundaries introduce structure where everything once felt undefined. They gently replace uncertainty with clarity. And that simple change begins transforming the emotional landscape. Stay with me, because this is often the point where the entire pattern starts changing in ways neither person expected. For someone who is emotionally distant, inconsistency can feel familiar. Pulling away feels normal. Emotional uncertainty becomes comfortable because it avoids difficult conversations, but healthy boundaries introduce something that cannot easily be ignored. They create clear expectations. They define what is and is not sustainable within the relationship. When the empath quietly communicates, either through words or actions, "I will no longer participate in patterns that constantly leave me uncertain," everything begins to feel different. The emotionally distant partner is no longer interacting with someone who remains endlessly available regardless of what happens. They are now relating to someone whose presence depends on mutual respect. That is not punishment. It is self-respect expressed through action. Healthy boundaries do not criticize or attack. They do not demand immediate transformation. They simply reveal reality. And reality is often what emotionally distant people struggle to face, because emotions without healthy structure can feel overwhelming. Suddenly, silence is no longer neutral. It carries consequences. Distance is no longer invisible. It changes the connection. Inconsistency is no longer quietly absorbed. It is reflected back as something that affects trust. That reflection creates discomfort, not because anyone is trying to create pain, but because the relationship is no longer adapting endlessly to one person's patterns. The empath has discovered they also have the ability to step back, and that single change alters everything. It creates a natural sense of emotional scarcity, not through manipulation, but through healthy self-protection. When something is no longer endlessly available, people naturally begin noticing its value in ways they previously overlooked. As access becomes less automatic, something deeper begins happening inside the emotionally distant partner. They may not speak about it immediately. They may not even fully understand it themselves. Yet internally, they begin noticing the difference. The familiar emotional availability they quietly depended upon is no longer guaranteed. They recognize that the relationship has shifted from unconditional presence to intentional participation. That realization starts another important process: reflection. When someone realizes a connection may no longer remain exactly as it has always been, they naturally begin paying closer attention. They notice the patience that was consistently offered. They recognize the emotional stability that quietly existed in the background. They remember the understanding that was available without constant demands. Now, those qualities are no longer assumed. They have become meaningful because they are no longer unlimited. There is an important psychological truth hidden inside this moment. People often appreciate something most deeply when they recognize it is no longer guaranteed. In this situation, that awareness is not created through emotional games. It grows naturally from genuine self-respect. The empath is not threatening to leave. They are simply living according to healthier boundaries. That quiet confidence introduces something unfamiliar into the relationship: choice. Instead of endless availability, there is now intentional engagement. Many emotionally distant relationships never reach this stage because they either become constant pursuit or complete detachment. Very few reach the place where calm boundaries exist without emotional drama. That is why this moment becomes so powerful. Conflict can often be dismissed. Emotional chaos can be explained away. But quiet consistency is much harder to ignore because it leaves very little room for misunderstanding. It invites honest reflection instead of emotional reaction. Over time, new questions may begin forming beneath the surface. Was this relationship more meaningful than I allowed myself to admit? Did I quietly assume this person's presence would always remain? What have I actually been losing every time I created distance? These realizations rarely arrive all at once. They unfold slowly, often during moments of quiet after space has already grown between two people. Yet they usually begin with one simple change. Someone chose to stop abandoning themselves simply to maintain closeness. That decision marks an important turning point because the relationship is no longer driven entirely by old emotional habits. It begins moving toward conscious choices instead. The empath is no longer only participating in the relationship. They are helping define the kind of relationship they are willing to have. When someone clearly communicates how they deserve to be treated, not through demands but through steady actions, they reshape the emotional atmosphere around them. Real emotional influence rarely comes from control. It comes from consistency. People often remember the individuals who quietly inspired them to grow rather than those who endlessly adjusted themselves to remain accepted. This shift is about much more than emotional distance. It is an emotional recalibration. In many emotionally distant relationships, there is an unspoken assumption that the empath will always remain available no matter what happens, even after silence, even after withdrawal, even after repeated inconsistency. That dependable emotional presence quietly becomes a safety net. It allows one person to create distance without fully experiencing the possibility of genuine loss. But eventually the empath reaches an honest realization. Emotional energy cannot be poured endlessly into a one-sided connection without consequences. They stop over-explaining. They stop carrying the emotional weight for both people. They stop filling every silence with hope. Instead, they gradually bring that emotional energy back to themselves. Outwardly, it may simply appear as greater quietness. Internally, however, it is something much deeper. It is a return to themselves, and that return is often felt long before it is understood. The emotionally distant partner senses an absence that is difficult to explain because the emotional foundation they quietly relied upon has shifted. The connection no longer feels like temporary distance with guaranteed access waiting in the background. It feels like distance with real emotional change. That difference matters. Now they are no longer relating to someone who endlessly compensates for disconnection. They are relating to someone who values both love and self-respect equally. And sometimes that quiet change becomes the very beginning of genuine transformation for both people.